In this video, I will discuss how shared documents can be used for a literature assignment that asks students to annotate a text. When students are asked to provide a number of interpretive annotations to a digital text in a shared collaborative space, we can recreate something closer to the experience of a seminar and push further into something beyond the limits of face-to-face learning. So let's talk about using shared documents as a way to allow students to collaborate on annotations of an open source literary text. For this video, I'm going to talk about leveraging Google Docs. This will, of course, require your students to leave your learning management system and enter into a free Google Drive. Make sure to give all of the students editing permissions. You'll need to find a version of a text that is legal to reproduce. Due to the nature of copyrights, this lesson plan works best with older texts that have slipped into public domain. As you might be aware, Project Gutenberg is one of the best resources for digitized versions of public domain texts. Once you've identified what text you want the students to annotate, you will copy it into a shared Google Doc, where multiple students can open and even edit at the same time. There are a couple of approaches to layout to consider. Perhaps the easiest and most accessible approach is to simply paste the digitized text into the Google Doc and invite students to put their notes directly into the text. I recommend breaking the text up into sections. Provide clear headers for source text and notes, so that students relying on e-readers will know when they are reading from the literary text and when they are reading from their classmates' notes. When students leave their notes, you'll want them to identify themselves, perhaps by using the first part of their email address. You can then use the search feature to find all of an individual's posts when grading. Alternatively, you might ask the students to use Google Docs' comment feature. This will allow students to thread their conversations and keep the source text itself clean. Students can tag each other and get notifications of responses, and the comments are associated with specific words in the text. You might also use tables to format the text. Now this gets a little trickier because accessibility best practices ask us to avoid using tables solely for formatting purposes. In this case, we are technically classifying information under the labels of source and notes. When I asked a colleague to test the table in an e-reader, she found that it read the Google Docs by columns. This is a problem if you're dealing with a long text, so I recommend using one table for each section you would like the students to comment on. Use a top row to label columns as source text or notes. Using tables means that notes stay closer to the passages they relate to. They also create a certain degree of equity between the learner and the author, since the student's comments will appear side by side with the primary source. It was also, frankly, easier to read and improve the chances that they would read each other's comments. One liability is that a student could, in theory, manipulate the source text. Remind students that Google Docs maintain a version history and identifies who makes each change. I also found this version history useful whenever a student forgot to identify themselves. A quick note on assessment. Here's a sample rubric you can use if you would like to grade this exercise. An annotation exceeds expectation when it interprets the text in an original or thought-provoking way, and/or applies a course concept in an original and convincing way, and/or asks a question that suggests close attention to detail and disrupts a surface reading of the text. A thoughtful, respectful response to a peer's annotation might also exceed expectation. An annotation meets expectation when it interprets the text beyond the surface reading and/or applies a course concept in a reasonable way, and/or asks a question that shows attention to detail and/or provides relevant personal reflection on the passage. An annotation does not meet expectation when it paraphrases or summarizes the text, misrepresents the text or applies a course concept in a way that misrepresents the concept, or provides a personal anecdote that does not seem relevant, or responds to a peer's annotation in a way that is not respectful. This exercise demonstrates the student's ability to interpret a text, and also demonstrates their broader knowledge of the work without relying on more objective assessments like quizzes. To help learners unfamiliar with annotations, I provided detailed instructions, including sample annotations with explanations of what made the samples effective or ineffective. Earlier, I said this lesson tries to recreate the face-to-face experience, but online learning can create a different environment and experience with benefits that face-to-face learning sometimes lacks. For instance, students simply have more time to draft, compose, and think about their responses to the text than they do in class. This creates equity for students who need more time to contemplate answers, or who feel less comfortable speaking in front of their peers. Even more importantly, it allowed for a wider range of conversation. Passages or ideas that might seem like a tangent to bring up in a conversation or discussion assignment can receive attention and blossom organically into back and forth between students. Speaking of time, Using shared documents allows students to communicate across sections or across semesters. Valuable annotations can be preserved for future students to read. Students can be required or rewarded for providing explanatory notes in addition to their interpretive ones, such as definitions for terms or footnotes on historical details. This lesson lends itself to the possibility of student-created editions of literary texts. Just make sure to get students' permission to reuse their work. Thank you for listening. If you would like to talk more about this use of shared documents or show how you've approached annotating text in online courses, please feel free to reach me at andrew.bossert@umgc.edu.